Mason Reed was once a war hero. Now he waits on death row, convicted of a murder he swears he didn't commit. As his final hour approaches, he asks for only one thing: to see Leah, the little girl he raised as a daughter. What begins as a goodbye takes an unexpected turn when Leah hands him a torn piece of his old jacket and unknowingly unlocks a secret no one saw coming. Her memories, once dismissed, may be the key to exposing a devastating truth, but time is running out. Can a child's quiet faith undo years of silence, lies, and betrayal? Stay with us, because what happens next will change everything. At exactly 6 a.m., the buzz of the security gate jolted Mason Reed out of a silence he'd been sitting in for hours. He didn't stand, not immediately. The guards waited. He'd asked for only one thing before the end: not a final meal, not a prayer, not even a letter. Just to see her. The girl he hadn't seen in almost 5 years. The girl whose laughter he used to chase through the garden at dusk. Who called him dad without needing to be told she could. Leah, now 10, now a stranger. And yet as they led him into the visitation room, hands cuffed, back straighter than it had been in years, his heart started to pace like it remembered something his mind had tried to bury. He didn't know what to expect. Maybe resentment. Maybe fear. She had every right. He was the man the news said killed someone. A murderer. A liar. A disgrace. But when the door opened and he saw her, tiny, motionless, clutching a square of torn fabric to her chest like a child gripping a parachute, Mason's breath stalled. She looked exactly like the last photo he had burned into memory, except this time she was crying. He sat down slowly, taking the seat across from her, separated by 2 inches of reinforced glass that felt like miles. She didn't speak, neither did he. For almost a minute they simply looked at each other. Her face was thinner than he remembered, paler, her eyes darker, not from makeup but from nights awake, most likely afraid. His fists clenched reflexively. What had she been through? What hadn't he protected her from? Mason had thought of this moment endlessly, scripted 100 apologies, rehearsed the way he'd explain everything: the arrest, the trial, the silence. But now, faced with her trembling hands and that quiet grief she wasn't old enough to carry, he couldn't summon a single word. The phone beside him remained untouched. She didn't reach for hers either. Then slowly, Leah leaned forward and pressed the scrap of fabric against the glass. Mason squinted, heart thudding. It was from his old Navy jacket, the one she used to sneak from the laundry basket to sleep with when storms made her afraid. "I kept it," she mouthed, barely audible. All this time, his chest cracked. Not broke, cracked. Because somehow this child, the one everyone told him would forget him, had remembered the smallest thing, and she'd held onto it. He nodded once, hard like a man trying not to drown. His hand, still cuffed, hovered near the glass, not quite touching it. Leah mirrored the gesture. Her fingers were too small to cover his, but they lined up palm to palm, separated only by invisible boundaries: years, trials, accusations, bureaucracy, trauma. "They said you did it," she whispered, finally lifting the phone, her voice barely more than breath. "I didn't believe them. Not once." Mason's lips parted, but what could he say? "Thank you. I'm sorry." Nothing felt enough. "I missed your stories," she continued. "The ones about the sea, about swimming with your eyes closed." Mason blinked hard. He had told her those stories to help her sleep. Tellies of swimming blind to trust your instincts. "You always knew where the shore was," she said, clutching the jacket scrap tighter. Mason leaned in, voice hoarse. "I don't anymore." A pause. Then Leah, firm, steady. "Yes, you do. You just forgot." And in that moment, she wasn't the child. She wasn't even the victim. She was the anchor, the only person who hadn't let go. He looked at her again, really looked, and something long dead inside him stirred. A kind of knowing. A kind of grief so ancient it no longer had a name. Behind the observation window, Detective Warren Harlow stood motionless, a paper cup of coffee cooling untouched in his hand. He hadn't planned on staying. He'd been on his way out of the building when he saw Leah being escorted in, her face down, her shoulders squared in a way that reminded him too much of Mason's during the arrest. It had been a clean case, open and shut. The motive made sense. The fingerprints aligned. And Mason Reed had barely fought back. He'd accepted the sentence with the kind of silence that prosecutors love. But now, as Harlow watched the girl press something, some kind of fabric, to the glass and saw the way Mason crumbled on the other side, he felt a pull in his gut he couldn't name. The way Leah spoke, her tone, her details, ... Something didn't sit right. Not just sentiment, specifics. She had details. Things a child couldn't make up. Things he didn't remember from the original report. He tried to brush it off, just trauma echoing. But the feeling clawed back, hard. His eyes locked on the torn scrap. It looked old, too old, almost ... like evidence. Harlow shifted his weight, unease growing roots in his spine. He'd built a career on seeing through lies, but what if the lie was in the case file itself? Inside the visitation room, Mason finally spoke. His voice was quieter now, rough around the edges, shaped by solitude and regret. I don't know if I'm getting out. Leah, I don't want you to think. You will, she interrupted, not sharply, but with certainty. You have to. He flinched. Her eyes bore into him, not pleading, not dramatic, just honest. He couldn't tell if it was faith or desperation. Maybe both. They'll listen, she added. They have to. I told Reverend Sullivan what I remembered. He said he'd talked to someone. That hit him like a current. Leah had spoken? About the night? What had she remembered? He leaned in, but before he could ask, she said something so softly he almost missed it. It smelled like metal, like burned metal. Your coat. That night, Mason froze. That detail, that exact phrase, had once been buried in the original police report. He'd said it in passing. No one had written it down. No one except maybe ... Harlow. Mason turned his head ever so slightly, eyes searching for the window. And there he was. Harlow. Watching, frowning, remembering. And that's when it happened. A shift so small it might have gone unnoticed to anyone else. But not to Mason, and not to Harlow. In that exact breath, time seemed to loop. Not backward, not forward, but inward. Mason turned back to Leah, who now had her hand fully against the glass, her eyes rimmed in red but unblinking. She whispered one final thing, too soft for the mic, too sacred for the world. Come home. Mason's fingers pressed against hers, just enough to feel the chill of the barrier. Something inside him finally broke, not in despair, in release. And behind the glass, Harlow slowly stepped back, the coffee cup now forgotten on the floor. Because something he hadn't felt in years, had just stirred in the pit of his conscience. Doubt. Real. Living doubt. The girl wasn't lying, and suddenly the last request didn't feel like an ending anymore. It felt like the first crack in a wall that was never meant to stand. Mason's boots scraped softly along the floor as the guards led him back to his cell. His shoulders sagged, not from exhaustion, but from the weight Leah had unknowingly placed on him with her presence. Her eyes, her words, they stuck to him like ash after a fire, hard to brush off, impossible to ignore. He didn't speak on the walk back, neither did the guards. Something about the air around him had shifted. They sensed it too. Inside his cell, he sat heavily on the cot, elbows on his knees, the cuff marks on his wrists still raw. He stared at the floor, not seeing it. Instead, he saw her hand, pressed to the glass. Heard her voice saying, "Come home." He knew he didn't deserve it, but God, he wanted to. Meanwhile, in the visitation hallway, Leah stood still, not ready to leave. Her fingers toyed with the frayed edges of the jacket scrap as she looked up at Reverend Sullivan, who had come to escort her back to the waiting room. But her eyes said she wasn't finished yet. "I need to tell you something," she murmured. The Reverend paused, surprised by the gravity in her voice. "Tell me, child," he said, kneeling. "All of it." Leah glanced over her shoulder first, as if to make sure no one else was listening, then leaned in. "I remember the night the police came," she began, voice just above a whisper. "I couldn't sleep. I had a stomach ache. I got up to look for the heating pad, and I heard yelling from the garage." Her small hands clenched the jacket scrap tighter. Not Mason's voice, the other one. It was deeper, angry, scared too. Reverend Sullivan nodded, his face still, but his eyes attentive. "Did you recognize the voice?" he asked gently. Leah shook her head. "No, but I remember something else." After the yelling stopped, Mason came inside. He didn't know I was awake. He hugged me. I smelled something weird on his jacket, like ... metal, but burned and sharp. Quote, "Not like blood. Different." The Reverend furrowed his brow. "And you're sure it was that night?" Leah looked up at him, eyes unwavering. "I know because I kept the jacket piece that night. I tore it off the next morning when I thought they'd take everything that smelled like him." Sullivan exhaled slowly, the weight of her words settling in. "There's more," she added. "I found something on the garage floor, a gold piece. I didn't know what it was. I hid it in my jewelry box." The Reverend's heartbeat picked up. "Do you still have it?" he asked, his voice suddenly laced with urgency. Leah nodded solemnly. "Yes, it's under the fake bottom drawer. I didn't know if it mattered. I just knew it didn't feel right to throw it away." Sullivan placed a hand on her shoulder. Lair, what you're telling me might be very important. More important than you realize. She blinked, her face a mix of fear and pride. Do you think it'll help Mason? She asked. The Reverend didn't lie. He never did, I don't know. But I think we need to tell someone who might. He guided her down the hall with surprising speed, his usual calm replaced with restrained intensity. In the staff room, Reverend Sullivan requested access to the prison's liaison line and made a call to Detective Warren Harlow. I have something you need to hear, he said, voice grave. Harlow, already restless from the earlier visitation, agreed to meet him at the station within the hour. Sullivan looked down at Leah, who stood beside him, silent now, but holding her scrap of fabric like it was armor. You did the right thing, sweetheart, he whispered. She didn't reply, but the look in her eyes said she knew. By the time Sullivan reached the precinct and stepped into Harlow's office, the detective was already seated with Mason's old case file splayed across his desk, pages and photographs he hadn't looked at in nearly 5 years. The Reverend didn't waste time with pleasantries. The girl remembered things, specific things, he said. Harlow looked up, mildly skeptical but curious. Like what? The smell of scorched metal on Mason's jacket, yelling in the garage, and most importantly, a gold object she found and hid. She still has it. Harlow froze. He looked down at the case notes. There was a Rolex, he muttered. Montgomery always wore one. It's shattered during this struggle. We found pieces, but the time stem was never recovered. He rubbed his temples, frowning. She might have it. The Reverend leaned forward. But you know what that means, Warren? That piece, if it has blood, skin cells, anything, it could change the whole case. Harlow didn't answer right away. He opened the drawer, pulled out an old photo of Montgomery's arm, the broken watch half visible. He'd thought it was irrelevant back then. But something about that missing fragment had always nagged at him. He just hadn't listened. Now, thanks to the girl, the nagging had a voice. That night, Harlow didn't go home. He stayed in his office, rereading every line of Mason's testimony, every forensic note, every offhand comment dismissed as insignificant. Mason had mentioned the smell once. It was like copper burning, he'd said, but the prosecution had waved it off. Harlow, back then, hadn't pushed. Why would he? The case was clean. A motive, a fight, fingerprints. Of something alive. Of the crime scene photos. The ones from inside the garage. The ones from inside the garage. The ones from inside the garage. In one frame, by the corner of the tool shelf, something metallic glinted. He zoomed in. The resolution was poor, but the shape was familiar. A watch stem. The damn thing had been there the whole time. It just hadn't been logged. Why hadn't anyone noticed? Or had someone purposely left it out? Harlow leaned back in his chair, eyes staring through the walls. The girl had remembered the one piece that could make the entire case unravel. She had seen it, smelled it, lived it, and she had stayed silent not out of guilt, but out of fear. Now she was speaking. And suddenly, Harlow wasn't sure they had convicted the right man. As the hour crept past midnight, Harlow dozed off at his desk, not out of peace, but out of exhaustion, his thoughts still cycling like gears stripped of their teeth. In the silence of his dreams, a sound returned, one he hadn't thought about in years. Not the gunshot, not the screams, but the tick. A slow, rhythmic, broken tick of a shattered Rolex as it dangled from Victor Montgomery's wrist. He remembered seeing it at the scene, the face cracked, the strap torn. He had stepped over it, maybe even kicked it aside. He remembered thinking it was odd that a man so wealthy would wear something so old-fashioned. But more than that, he remembered how it wasn't included in the evidence report. Why hadn't he questioned it? Why had he let it go? He stirred in his sleep, frowning. The watch ticked louder now in his mind, like a countdown he'd ignored too long. And when he awoke, heart racing, shirt damp, he knew. The girl's memory wasn't just valid, it was key. He got up, turned on the desk lamp, and circled the word Rolex in red ink. His hand trembled slightly as he underlined it twice. Why the hell was it never entered into evidence? He whispered into the empty room. Detective Warren Harlow had never been a man plagued by self-doubt until now. The memory of Lia's voice clung to him like residue he couldn't wash off. That child hadn't just remembered things, she'd carried them like scars stitched under the skin. And now those memories had unearthed something in Harlow he wasn't prepared for. Guilt. Real, biting, suffocating guilt. He tried to shake it off as he walked through the bowels of the station toward the evidence locker. But the closer he got, the heavier his steps became. At the secure desk, he flashed his badge with unnecessary force, muttering the old case number. The clerk squinted at him, confused. "That file's dead," he said. Harlow didn't blink. "Open it anyway." The man hesitated, then keyed in the digits, unlocking the drawer with a reluctant sigh. Harlow pulled the box free, labeled, taped, forgotten, and set it on the nearest table like he was lowering a coffin. One by one, he laid out the pieces: bagged clothes, the grainy crime scene photos, the damaged wrench they had labeled the murder weapon. Then, buried near the bottom, a supplemental report folder, newer by the look of the ink. He flipped it open and froze. A recent log entry marked in red: "Item inconclusive, not submitted into evidence." It hit him like a punch. The entry was dated after the trial. The handwriting wasn't his. The log referred to a metallic fragment recovered post-incident, later deemed irrelevant due to lack of prosecutorial value. Harlow gritted his teeth. That wasn't procedure. That was burial. Quiet burial. And someone had signed off on it. His hand clenched into a fist as he read the signature, a junior officer who had since transferred out. Harlow tossed the file aside, heart racing. His mind replayed Mason's interrogation, the man's silence, the way he'd stared at the wall, not defiant, not arrogant, just quiet. At the time, Harlow had read it as guilt. Now he saw it differently. Mason hadn't been hiding something. He'd been grieving something. Grieving the betrayal already setting in around him. Harlow remembered the moment clearly, the coffee going cold on the table, the way Mason had only spoken once. "If I tell you what really happened, will you even listen?" And Harlow had said nothing. That silence came back now with razor edges. He grabbed the bagged wrench and stared at it like it might confess something. Then he turned back to the logbook, fury rising like a wave. Someone had made sure the right questions were never asked. He stormed out of the evidence room and made a beeline for his office, heart thudding in his ears. Once inside, he shut the door and pulled out his personal notebook, the one he used when things didn't make sense. On the first page, he wrote, "Montgomery case, suppressed evidence." Then he listed everything Leah had remembered: the smell, the metal, the hidden object. He drew arrows between them, connecting dots no one had ever bothered to connect. The stem of the watch, the burn residue, the silence Mason had held like a shield. His pen scratched faster now, racing his thoughts. It didn't add up, or worse, it added up too well. Someone had scrubbed this case, wiped it clean of complications. The question was why. He picked up his phone, heart pounding. This wasn't just a detective's hunch anymore. It was grounds. If he was wrong, his badge was on the line. But if he was right, an innocent man had been left to die. He called the governor's liaison. "This is Detective Warren Harlow," he said, his voice hard. "I need an emergency stay of execution. 2 hours. Just 2. I believe the conviction of Mason Reed may be compromised." The voice on the other end paused. "Detective, that kind of request has to go through channels." Harlow didn't flinch. "Then start the channels. Immediately. I've reopened the file. Or have material that was marked inconclusive after trial. There is evidence that was never disclosed, potentially exculpatory, a longer silence. You're saying the prosecution withheld evidence? I'm saying I can't unsee what I've just seen. And if I don't say something now, you'll be executing the wrong man." Harlow could hear the clicking of keys in the background, the shifting of protocol. "What's the time frame?" the liaison asked. Harlow looked at his watch. "He's set for 6 a.m. tomorrow. I need until at least 8 o'clock. That's all I'm asking." Another pause, then, "I'll get back to you within an hour. Keep your phone on." The call ended, and Harlow set the phone down slowly, as if afraid of what might come next. He didn't sit. He couldn't. He walked in circles, muttering names to himself. Montgomery, Mason, Leah, Grant. One of them held the key, or maybe all of them did. But someone, somewhere, had decided Mason Reed was easier to bury than to believe. And Harlow had gone along with it until now. The waiting was the worst part. Minutes dragged like molasses, the phone silent, his hands restless. He pulled Montgomery's file again, flipping to the forensic timeline. Time of death. Between 11:40 p.m. and 12:05 a.m., Mason had been found at 12:09, in his garage, washing blood off his arms. An impossible window if he'd come from across town, unless he'd teleported. Harlow scribbled in the margins. Framed. It was a dangerous word to write, dangerous to think, but it explained too much. Mason had history with Montgomery. They'd fought publicly over real estate, over military contracts, even over Abby, years before she became Mason's partner. It was motive on a platter. But if someone wanted Montgomery dead, really dead, Mason was perfect, predictable, loud, angry, and expendable. Harlow's eyes burned from the sleepless night, but he forced himself to keep going. He opened his laptop and began compiling a report. 1 page, then 2, then 5. Every inconsistency, every missing piece, every manipulated file. If the governor granted the stay, he'd be ready. If not, he'd send it anyway, let the world see. Someone remember. Then, just as dawn began to stretch behind the blinds, the phone rang. Harlow didn't breathe as he answered. "Detective Harlow," said the voice. "The governor has approved a 2-hour stay of execution for Mason Reed, effective immediately. Use your time wisely." Harlow closed his eyes, something between relief and rage coursing through him. He had bought them time. Not much, but enough. He scribbled the new time, 8 a.m. in red ink across the top of Mason's file, drawing a line underneath it like a promise. The clock hadn't stopped, but it had slowed. And for the first time in 5 years, the timeline didn't just move forward. It was beginning to tick backward. Leah knew exactly where to look. Her small fingers moved with purpose as she climbed the old wooden chair in her bedroom, pulling down the tattered cardboard box from the top shelf of her closet. The box had lived there for years, sealed shut with mismatched tape, labeled only with a childish scrawl that read important. She didn't know why she had kept the piece back then. It hadn't made sense to her, just a bit of broken metal that didn't belong to any of her toys, sharp and cold and oddly heavy for its size. But that night, everything had felt strange, and her instincts, even at 5 years old, had told her to hide it. She had wrapped it in tissue paper and slid it beneath the fake bottom of her jewelry box, the one Abby had given her when Mason first moved in. As she opened it now, the memory of that moment surged back with aching clarity. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pulled out the old tissue. Carefully unwrapping it, she revealed the jagged, gold-tipped stem, still untouched. She didn't know what it was, but she knew it mattered. She always had. Abby stood silently in the doorway, watching her. She hadn't asked what Leah was doing when the girl had suddenly gotten up and marched toward her bedroom with such silent resolve, but something in Leah's posture had stilled her. Now, as she saw what lay in the girl's palm, the breath caught in her throat. "Leah," she whispered, stepping closer. "Where did you get that?" Leah didn't look up. "I found it the night the police came. I was going to throw it away. ... But something told me not to." Abby took another step forward, crouching until she was eye level. Her hands, usually so steady, trembled as she reached for the piece. She didn't need to ask what it was. She had seen Victor Montgomery's watch a dozen times at social events, remembered how he flicked the stem absent-mindedly during boring speeches. The piece in her hand now. It was unmistakable. A chunk of that very watch. "Why didn't you tell me before?" Abby asked softly. Leah finally met her gaze. "I didn't know it meant anything. I just wanted to keep something that felt ... safe." Abby swallowed hard, the weight of years of silence crashing into her. "It means everything, Leah," she said, voice cracking. They sat on the floor for a long moment, the velvet pouch resting between them, the gold stem now inside it. Leah kept her gaze low, her small hands folded tightly in her lap. "Will it help bring him home?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Abby couldn't speak at first. Her throat had closed up, her heart thudding painfully behind her ribs. For years she had balanced hope on a knife's edge. She had defended Mason to anyone who would listen, screamed at lawyers, written letters, fought until her own voice gave out. And yet she had always feared that nothing would be enough, that the system was too big, too blind. But this broken stem in a child's hand was real, tangible, unexplainable. Evidence. Her hand closed around the pouch as tears filled her eyes. She nodded slowly, biting back the emotion. "Yes," she whispered. "I think it will." Leah didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She only nodded as if that was the answer she already knew. Abby reached for her phone, her fingers still shaking, and called Harlow. "We're coming," she said. "We have something you need to see." She didn't give him time to ask questions. She ended the call and turned to Leah. "Get your coat." The ride to Seacliff Prison wasn't long, but it felt endless. Neither of them spoke much. Leah sat in the back seat, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, eyes fixed on the small velvet pouch in Abby's lap. Occasionally her gaze would flick upward, not at the road, but at Abby's reflection in the rearview mirror. She could see the tension in her face, the way her jaw clenched every time the GPS barked a direction. Abby drove with both hands on the wheel, eyes forward, locked into something far away, maybe 5 years away. "Will he be mad?" Leah asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Abby blinked, pulled from her thoughts. "Mad? That I waited this long to tell?" Abby's heart broke a little more. "No, baby," she said gently. "He'll understand. You were just a kid, you did the best you could, and now..." Now you're doing something no one else could." Leah absorbed that quietly, then looked back down at her hands. "I hope he remembers me." Abby glanced at her in the mirror. "There isn't a second he's forgotten you," and that was the truth. Every letter Mason had written from prison, unread by Leah because Abby couldn't bear to deliver them, had started with her name. When they reached the prison gates, Abby parked in the visitors' lot but didn't move immediately. She looked down at the pouch in her lap like it might burn a hole through her jeans. Leah leaned forward between the seats. "Are we giving it to the police?" Abby exhaled. "To Harlow. He's already waiting inside." Leah nodded solemnly. "He used to be the bad guy." "I know," Abby said, "but maybe he's trying to fix it now." There was no joy in the words, no absolution, just quiet truth. Abby stepped out of the car and opened the back door, helping Leah down. The pouch was still clutched in her hand. Together they walked toward the prison doors, not hand in hand, but side by side, like partners carrying something sacred. Leah didn't speak again until they were buzzed through the first gate. "If this works," she whispered, "will we go home with him?" Abby hesitated only a moment. "If it works, he'll finally have a home to come back to." Leah gave a tiny nod and the door slid open. Back at home, Leah had rummaged through boxes of memories and found the object, a broken watch stem, gold-tipped, jagged. Abby had trembled as she placed it in a small velvet pouch. Leah hadn't asked what it was. She had only asked, "Will it help bring him home?" And the answer had been a quiet nod, choked by tears. Together they headed to Seacliff Prison. Wilson Grant hadn't looked anyone in the eye since walking into courtroom 2B, not even when he passed Mason in shackles, sitting as still as a statue in his defendant's seat. For days the pressure had been mounting, not from threats or bribes, but from something worse: the erosion of his own silence. When the immunity agreement was placed in front of him, ink ready, his signature trembling, it wasn't legal fear that broke him. It was the weight of Leah's testimony, of a little girl who remembered what grown men had chosen to forget. Now standing on the witness stand with the prosecutor's questions biting and the defense silent by design, Wilson finally met the eyes of the room. Not Mason's, not the judge's, but Abby's, the woman who had once shaken his hand at a charity gala and thanked him for protecting the city. His voice cracked on the first word. "I lied." A pause. Then, like floodgates breaking, "I lied about everything. We framed him. We planted the jacket. I left the stem in the truck to make it look messy. Just messy enough to convict, but not messy enough to raise eyebrows. Victor ... He was never supposed to talk." The courtroom went silent, but Wilson kept talking, as if now that he'd started, he couldn't stop. Victor Montgomery was going to turn us in, the whole lot of us. He had documents, recordings, bank transfers. I saw them. I saw them with my own eyes. He said he'd made copies. That he'd already spoken to someone in the press. We couldn't take that risk. I didn't kill him. I didn't pull the trigger. But I know who did. I know who paid for it. And I know exactly why Mason was chosen. He was loud, proud, and too stubborn for his own good. He argued with Victor at a veterans fundraiser in front of 30 people. That was all we needed. Motive on a silver platter. The prosecutor interrupted. "You're saying the murder was premeditated by parties beyond this courtroom?" Wilson nodded. Judge Denham, D.A. Rowan, even Montgomery's own legal consultant, they all had something to lose. They used me to set the fire and Mason to take the fall. He looked toward Mason at last, and I let them, because I thought it would end there. But it didn't. It followed me. Every day. Especially after I saw that girl on the news. Across the courtroom, Leah sat in a straight-backed chair between Abby and Reverend Sullivan. Her feet didn't reach the floor. Her hands were wrapped tightly in the sleeves of a coat 2 sizes too big, but her eyes didn't blink. Not once. She'd never seen Wilson Grant before this day, but somehow she recognized him. He was the man in the shadows of her memory, the one who smelled of oil and metal, who had spoken in a low voice through the walls the night her life changed. She didn't understand everything he said, but when he mentioned the stem, her body stiffened. Abby noticed. She placed a steadying hand on Leah's knee, but the girl didn't flinch. "Is he the one who took Daddy?" Leah whispered. Abby leaned down, lips trembling. "He helped," she answered honestly. Leah didn't cry. She didn't even frown. But her breath grew shallow, her chest rising and falling like something fragile teetering on the edge. Reverend Sullivan, sensing her tension, squeezed her other hand. "You're not alone, child. You never were." Leah nodded once, but her eyes stayed locked on the man confessing, the man who had stolen 5 years of her life with one quiet lie. Mason hadn't moved since the confession began. His eyes remained forward, hands resting in cuffs atop the defense table. But the tension in his shoulders told another story. Every word coming from Wilson's mouth was a knife, not because they confirmed Mason's innocence, but because they confirmed that everything he had believed, everything he had feared, was true. He hadn't been paranoid. He hadn't been delusional. They had planned it, constructed it, frame by frame, like some legal illusionist's trick. He glanced at his attorney only once. The man gave a faint nod, signaling that the confession was admissible, protected under the agreement. But Mason didn't care about technicalities. He cared about the fact that his daughter had spent 5 years sleeping in a bed too big, asking questions no one dared answer. He cared about Abby sitting in courtrooms and visitation rooms, trying to keep hope alive while the world called her delusional. And now, with truth dripping from the lips of the very man who helped destroy his life, Mason felt empty, not vindicated, not even angry, just emptied out, like the only thing he had left was silence, the same silence he'd held onto in his cell when no one believed him. As Wilson's confession wrapped, the judge asked if he understood the implications of his statement. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied. "I've lived with them long enough." The court recessed briefly and the room exhaled. Leah leaned into Abby's side, exhausted. Her hand still clutched the velvet pouch that once held the golden piece, now submitted into evidence. It had sat on the prosecution table all morning, small and silent and undeniable. Harlow had nodded to her once, a quiet acknowledgement of what her memory had made possible. "Will they let him go now?" she asked Abby. The woman didn't answer because it wasn't over yet. But the scales had shifted. For the first time in years, the truth had its day. And it had come not from documents or surveillance footage, but from the trembling voice of a man who could no longer live with the weight of his lies. The confession wasn't an ending. It was a reckoning. Under the flickering lights of courtroom 2B, the truth had broken loose. Wilson Grant, pressed by the weight of immunity deals and years of buried guilt, had confessed everything. The cover-up, the planted evidence, the jacket left in Mason's truck, the watch stem discarded, all of it orchestrated. Across the courtroom, Mason hadn't reacted, but Leah, seated between Abby and Reverend Sullivan, had let out a shaky breath. Her hands were still dirty from digging through the past. Mason Reed stood still at the top of the courthouse steps, the wind brushing his face like it didn't know him anymore. His boots, polished by hands not his own, didn't feel like they belonged to his feet. The air was too clean, too sharp, like a scent from a life he'd left behind. For 5 years he had imagined this moment, walking out head high, justice behind him. But now that it was real, it landed with a strange, unfamiliar weight. He didn't smile. He didn't breathe deeply or lift his hands in triumph. Instead, he waited, silently, because part of him still feared the ground beneath him would collapse and drag him back into the concrete hell he had just escaped. Then, through the crowd, she broke through, small, fast, and unstoppable. Leah. Her arms wrapped around his waist before he could brace himself, and he staggered a step, not from her strength, but from the shock. He looked down, seeing the top of her head pressed against him, her hair a little longer than he remembered, but still soft. "Leah?" he choked out. She looked up, eyes wet but defiant. "You came back." He touched her face, still not trusting it. "You waited," she didn't blink. "I never stopped." The moment settled around them, heavy with a kind of fragile joy neither dared fully touch. Mason held her tighter, anchoring himself in the warmth of her, in the unbelievable fact that she hadn't changed the way the world had. He looked up only when Abby approached, slower, more hesitant. Her smile was soft, but her eyes held questions. "You're really here," she said quietly. Mason nodded, then stepped back, one arm still around Leah. "I didn't think I'd ever see your face in daylight again," he admitted. "I tried to write. I didn't know if they reached you." Abby looked down. "I did. I wasn't sure if it would help or make it worse. For me." Mason didn't push. He knew guilt when he saw it. He'd worn that look himself for years, knowing you did your best, but wondering if your best was enough. Leah tugged at his sleeve. "Can we go now?" she asked. Mason crouched, brushing a stray hair from her cheek. "We can go anywhere you want," she smiled at that. But as they walked toward the waiting car, Mason couldn't shake the sensation that something in her step seemed just a beat too slow. The ride back to the house was a quiet one. Leah rested her head on Mason's arm the entire way, like she was afraid he might vanish if she blinked. Abby drove, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, pretending not to glance in the mirror every few minutes. Mason tried to ask about school, about the plants in the front yard, about her favorite cereal, the kind of things a father would ask if he'd only been gone a few days. Leah answered, but softly, and not with the energy he remembered. It wasn't just tiredness. It was like her voice had learned to stay quiet too long and had forgotten how to raise itself again. Abby caught his eye in the mirror once. That was when he saw it. The hesitation in her, like there was something she wasn't saying. But Mason let it go. One problem at a time. For now, they were together. He laid his hand over Leah's where it rested on his arm. She didn't move it, just turned her head slightly, closed her eyes, and smiled. He didn't say a word for the rest of the drive. He just stared out the window, wondering why freedom felt so much like fear. Dinner was a strange echo of the life they'd once had. Abby cooked the same pasta Mason used to love, but he barely touched it. Leah ate 2 bites and asked to lie down. "Big day," Abby said, brushing her hair back and pressing a kiss to her forehead. "We'll talk more tomorrow, baby." Mason watched them from the kitchen table, eyes following Leah's small figure as she walked slowly down the hallway to her room. "She's grown," he said. "In ways you can't imagine," Abby answered, then silence. Mason turned to her. "What is it?" Abby sat across from him, folding her hands. "Some days she's full of energy. Other days she can't climb the stairs. The doctors say stress, trauma, emotional fatigue. They're not sure, but it's been getting worse." Mason's jaw tightened. "Since when?" "Since the 2nd year," Abby said, her voice breaking. "She stopped sleeping through the night, started getting dizzy spells. But after she talked to Reverend Sullivan, after she saw you again, she seemed lighter, stronger. I thought maybe..." She stopped herself. Mason leaned forward. "I need to know everything from now on. No more silences, Abby. We already lost too much." That night, after the dishes had been cleared and the bags unpacked, Mason sat alone on the edge of the couch, staring at nothing. Leah had fallen asleep quickly, her head on Abby's lap while they watched old cartoons on mute. The room had felt warm for the first time, like it remembered how to breathe. But something clung to Mason's chest, a weight that didn't lift. He remembered every moment in prison, not just the hours, but the minutes. He remembered how silence echoed louder than screams. But this kind of silence, after a confession, after a hug, after freedom, it was heavier. He got up to check on Leah before bed. She lay curled on her side, mouth slightly open, one hand resting on the velvet pouch that still sat beside her pillow. Mason leaned down, kissed her hair, and turned off the light. But as he stepped into the hallway, Abby's voice called out. "Mason," she said, her voice tense. He turned. "What is it?" Abby didn't answer. She pointed. Blood trickled from Leah's nose, slow and silent, soaking into her pillow. Mason froze. "Is this?" he started. Abby didn't let him finish. "It started last month," she whispered. "This isn't the first time." Mason had walked out of the courtroom into the open air for the first time in 5 years. Leah had run to him, arms tight around his waist, and he had flinched, not from pain, but from disbelief. He had touched her hair, then her face, as if expecting her to fade. "You waited," he had murmured. "I never stopped," she had replied. But Abby had watched quietly, her smile uncertain. Something in Leah's body had seemed too light, too fragile, and later that night her nose had bled without warning. The doctor didn't start with a greeting. He didn't waste time with pleasantries or false optimism. The man in the white coat sat across from Mason and Abby in a windowless consultation room and said the words that would change everything, again. "We believe Leah has a neurodegenerative disorder. It's rare, progressive, likely genetic, but stress, trauma, those things accelerated its expression." The air thickened, but Mason didn't react right away. He didn't blink or lean forward. He just stared at the man as if the words hadn't landed yet. Abby's hand went to her mouth. She had suspected, but hearing it confirmed turned the suspicion into something monstrous. "What does that mean?" Mason finally asked, his voice low, hollow. The doctor hesitated. "It means her symptoms will worsen. Fatigue, memory lapses, blood vessel fragility, possibly neurological deterioration. There are treatments, experimental, costly, and with limited success rates. But if we act fast, we can try to slow it down." Abby closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek. Mason stood up abruptly. "How long?" he demanded. The doctor didn't answer. He looked at the floor. That silence was the answer. And for Mason, it was a different kind of sentence, one he couldn't serve in her place. Back at the house, Mason sat motionless in the armchair. Leah curled into his lap like she had when she was 3, her breathing soft and steady, unaware of the tidal wave that had just hit the adults around her. Abby moved around the room in quiet motions, preparing tea, folding a blanket, cleaning a space that didn't need cleaning, all to keep from breaking apart. Mason didn't speak. His arms were wrapped around Leah as if holding her tighter might somehow fix what was inside her, like strength alone could push back what medicine couldn't. He felt her warmth, the weight of her against him, and something cracked open in his chest. Not the kind of fracture prison had left, but something deeper, more permanent. He pressed his face into her hair, eyes clenched. "She doesn't know," he said, his voice strained. "She knows enough," Abby replied softly. "She knows something's wrong. She's known for a while. But she won't say it unless we do. She's like you. She holds it all in until it breaks." Mason let that sit. The pain was too sharp for words. He didn't know how to be strong anymore. Not for this. Not for something he couldn't fight with fists or fire or fury. Later, after Leah had fallen asleep in his arms, Mason carried her to her room and laid her down gently, tucking the blanket up to her chin. She stirred only once, whispering something under her breath. He leaned closer. "You're here now," she murmured, not even opening her eyes. Those 3 words stabbed deeper than any accusation, any injustice, any courtroom betrayal. Mason sat on the edge of her bed for a long time, watching her breathe, memorizing the rise and fall of her chest. The little lines that had started forming around her mouth, signs of pain she never spoke aloud. He wanted to scream, to break something, to go back in time and erase every moment that took him away from her. Instead, he reached for the velvet pouch on her nightstand, the one that once held the broken watch stem. He held it in his palm, useless now, a relic from one battle won while another began. "I'm here," he whispered back, voice shaking. "I swear I'm not going anywhere again." But the promise felt fragile, like paper in a storm. Because this time, the enemy wasn't men in suits or bars of steel. This time it was something silent, invisible, and already inside her. In the kitchen, Abby was sitting at the table, her face buried in her hands. Mason walked in slowly and sat across from her. They didn't speak for a while. The silence was different now, not the kind of silence that hangs after arguments or courtroom verdicts, but the kind that comes when 2 people are trying to carry something too heavy for words. "I should have noticed sooner," Abby said at last. "Maybe if I'd pushed harder with the doctors." Mason stopped her with a look. "Don't," he said. "We did what we could, and we're not done. Not by a long shot." She looked at him then, and for the first time since he'd returned, there was something new in her eyes. Not just relief or exhaustion. Trust. Mason reached for her hand and squeezed it. "We fought for me. Now we fight for her." Abby nodded, but her shoulders still trembled. "What if it's not enough?" Mason didn't answer right away. He looked toward the hallway where Lia's room stood like a quiet fortress. "Then we make sure she knows she's never alone. Not for a second. Not again." It wasn't hope, exactly, but it was something close. The next morning, phone calls were made. Medical records were requested. Appointments were scheduled with specialists in other states. Mason contacted the legal team handling his compensation case and redirected his priorities. No mansions, no silence, no revenge. Just time. Every dollar would be spent buying as much of it as possible. He knew better than to count on guarantees. He hadn't had one in years, but he could build a plan. He could give her the chance to fight. Abby helped organize the paperwork. Leah woke late, smiling as if nothing had happened, asking if Mason could make pancakes like he used to. He did. They burned slightly, but she said they tasted perfect. Later, as she drew pictures on the kitchen table, Mason sat beside her, pretending not to study every twitch of her fingers, every blink that lasted too long. He laughed when she laughed. He didn't let the cracks show. But every moment felt sharper now, as if time itself had a pulse and they were racing it. Mason had escaped one death sentence only to discover another waiting at home. The doctors had confirmed what Abby had feared but never said. Leah was sick, a rare degenerative disorder, worsened by emotional trauma. But Leah, curled in his lap, hadn't cried or trembled. She had only whispered, "You're here now." And for the first time since his release, Mason sobbed, not for himself, but for the little girl who had held on for him. The settlement cleared faster than expected. Mason didn't ask questions. He just signed whatever was needed and moved quickly, as if outrunning the shadow that still hovered over Leah. Abby handled the paperwork with a quiet precision, her fingers trembling only when she had to initial a line that used the word compensation. It never felt like a win. Mason had spent 5 years trying to survive a prison he didn't deserve. Now, he'd spend every breath making sure Leah didn't suffer in a body betraying her from within. The hospital in Ithaca wasn't the best in the world, but it was the only one with a trial program for Leah's condition that had room. The specialist had called Abby after reviewing her case. "She's borderline for admission, but something about her scans caught my attention," he said. "We're willing to try," that was all Mason needed. Within 48 hours, he was booking flights, signing waivers, and carrying Leah's favorite sketchpad in a worn backpack. Abby kissed them both at the terminal, too composed for goodbye. "Text me when you land," she said. "Promise me." Mason only nodded, lifting Leah gently into his arms when she started to cough again. They didn't look back. The flight was mostly silent. Leah sat by the window, eyes scanning the clouds like she was memorizing them. Mason watched her from the aisle seat, one hand resting gently on her knee, grounding her, grounding himself. At one point she turned to him and asked, "Was it scary being there?" "In prison?" Mason hesitated. "Yeah," he admitted, "but not the way you'd think. The scariest part was the silence. No one believing me. No one listening." Leah nodded, thoughtful. "That's what being sick feels like sometimes." She looked down at her lap. "Like your body knows something no one else does." He wanted to respond, to tell her she wasn't alone, that he would always believe her, always listen. But the words tangled in his throat. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and handed her the photo Abby had slipped into his hands before they left. Mason in his Navy uniform. Leah perched on his shoulders, both of them grinning like the world hadn't yet learned how to hurt them. Leah smiled softly. "I remember this. You were so serious that day until I said you looked like a pineapple in that hat." Mason laughed, surprised at the memory. "I forgot that. You never did let me take myself too seriously." At the hospital, they were led through the back corridors to a private wing where the pediatric experimental care unit was located. The nurse checked them in with a clipboard and a kind, tired smile. Mason filled out form after form, answering questions about allergies, sleep patterns, emotional behavior, everything that made Leah human and also vulnerable. When they finally reached the room, Leah crawled onto the narrow hospital bed without a word. She didn't cry. She didn't complain. She just placed the photo on the table beside her and curled her fingers around the corner like it was a talisman. Mason sat in the chair beside her, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. "I don't know how we got here," he muttered. Leah turned her head toward him. "We got here because you didn't give up." He didn't answer, but something in his jaw tightened. She reached out, touched his wrist, the one with the faded scar from a long-ago injury that never quite healed right. "That scar's always looked lonely," she whispered. "Like it needs something to remember." He looked at her, not understanding. "Your pen?" she said. "Do you have it?" He nodded slowly and pulled it from his pocket. Mason held the pen in his hand for a moment, heavy with hesitation. Then slowly, with a care that made his hands tremble, he rolled back his sleeve and pressed the tip to his skin. Over the scar, where the tissue dipped slightly, he began to write, "Leah," not with shaky letters, but bold, steady strokes. She watched him silently, her eyes wide, not because of the pain, but because of the intimacy of the gesture. She understood what it meant. He wasn't just writing her name. He was anchoring her to him, promising that no matter what came next, she was part of him now, permanent, unerasable. When he finished, she reached out and touched the ink. "That's better," she whispered. "Now it looks like someone remembered you back." Mason didn't know what to say. He felt something build in his chest. Not grief this time, not anger, but a strange kind of peace. She was still fighting, still making jokes, still seeing more than most people twice her age. It terrified him. And yet in that moment, she didn't look like someone sick. She looked like someone who still believed in something better waiting on the other side. Later that evening, the nurse came in with the force set up, and Mason stepped out into the hallway to give her space. He leaned against the wall, hands in his pockets, eyes closed. Could hear muted voices, Leah's soft replies, the nurse's gentle instructions, but he couldn't go back in just yet. Not until he steadied himself. He thought of the courtroom, of the first time he'd heard Wilson Grant confess. He'd thought that moment would be the hardest of his life. He was wrong. This was harder. Sitting in a white room with his daughter while doctors pushed chemicals through tubes in the hope they'd slow time. He thought of the promise he'd made to be there, to never disappear again, to live, not just for her, but because of her. He pulled his phone from his jacket and opened the photo again, zooming in on Leah's tiny fingers gripping the edge of his uniform. She'd been holding on since the beginning. He just hadn't known how much. In the hospital room, Leah was already curled back under the blanket when Mason returned. The photo was resting on her chest. Her eyes were open, calm. "If I don't make it," she said, barely above a whisper, "you have to keep living." Mason froze. The air felt razor thin. He wanted to tell her to hush, to never speak like that again, but he didn't. He crossed the room, sat beside her, and took her hand in his. He didn't speak, because there were no words large enough to contain what he felt. Instead, he rolled up his sleeve again, showing her the ink that had begun to fade but hadn't bled. Her name. right over the scar. Leah saw it and smiled. "That looks right," she said. Mason nodded once, still silent, still holding on, and this time not letting go. The first few weeks after admission felt like walking a tightrope made of breath and waiting. The treatment began with a series of delicate infusions and a strict schedule of medications that were new, barely tested, and came with a list of side effects longer than Lia's own body. The doctors had briefed Mason and Abby thoroughly before agreeing to begin, warning them gently, but firmly, that this wasn't a cure, it was a gamble. At best, Dr. Cowrie said, we slow the progression. At worst, we do nothing at all, but Leah didn't seem fazed. She sat through the briefings quietly, nodding, her expression unreadable until they were alone in her room again. Then she turned to Mason and said, "I know what they're saying, but they don't know me yet." There was no bravado in her tone, just quiet certainty, the kind that couldn't be taught. Mason believed her because he didn't know how not to. She'd been right too many times already. Every morning she'd wake up and say, "Let's win something today," even if that win was just keeping her breakfast down or walking from the bed to the window and back without help. In the afternoons, when her strength allowed, she drew, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours. Mason bought her a new sketchbook every week, and Abby mailed watercolors from home in padded envelopes decorated with hearts. Leah filled each page like it mattered. Her lines weren't perfect, her coloring was uneven, her hands trembled more now, but her vision was steady. She drew a house by the ocean, weather-worn but bright. Mason was there in the front yard, kneeling by a broken fence, holding a hammer. Abby stood at the doorway, round with pregnancy, her laugh caught mid-frame, and beside her, two babies, twins, or maybe just her imagination playing double. In every version of the drawing, Leah stood a little taller, her hair a little longer, always holding something golden in her hand, sometimes a flower, sometimes a locket, once a medal. "What's that?" Mason asked. "What's the gold mean?" Leah shrugged. "Hope, maybe," she said. "Or maybe it's just something shiny I don't want to draw." She didn't need to explain it further. Mason understood. The drawings were more than wishes. They were blueprints of belief, proof that she could still see a future worth fighting for. Abby came to visit whenever she could, staying in the temporary apartment a few blocks away. She brought food from home, fresh clothes, and quiet courage. Mason often caught her standing in the hallway before entering Lia's room, one hand pressed to her chest as if steadying herself before a dive. Inside, the three of them would fall into old rhythms, half-formed jokes, soft teasing, memories retold like bedtime stories. Abby brought out the version of Leah that Mason hadn't realized he missed. Playful, sarcastic, occasionally bossy. One afternoon, Abby brought a music box Leah had kept as a toddler. It was chipped and barely worked, but when she opened it, the warp tune still played, and Leah laughed for the first time in days. It sounded rusty, like a door opening. Mason looked at Abby across the bed, and for a moment, neither said a word. They just listened to their daughter remember how to be a child again. That night, after Abby had gone back to the apartment, Mason found Lia's newest drawing on the tray table, the ocean house again, but this time with a fourth figure standing beside her. "Who's that?" he asked. She looked up, eyes soft. "You, but older." One afternoon, after a long nap that stretched well past lunch, Mason sat at her bedside reading the same paragraph for the fifth time, unable to focus. Lia stirred beside him, her fingers twitching against the blanket. Slowly, they moved toward his hand and closed around it, weak but warm. Her eyes opened, sleepy but alert. She blinked up at him and said, "I think I'm winning." Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried something that made Mason freeze. Not hope, not relief, something purer, certainty. He didn't know what to say at first. He just stared at her, then kissed her hand and whispered, "You are." Within the hour, the doctors confirmed what her body had already known. Dr. Curie's tone was still cautious. Medicine didn't trade in miracles, but even he smiled. Her condition is stabilized. For now, that's all we can ask for. Mason shook his hand. Abby cried into his chest when he called her. Lia didn't react at all. She just whispered, "I told you." And Mason, laughing and weeping all at once, whispered back, "I'll never doubt you again." That night, back in the temporary apartment provided by the hospital foundation, Mason tucked Leah into the small fold-out couch, her forestand beside her like a silent guardian. She was tired but not weak. Her cheeks had color again. Her breaths came evenly. And she was drawing again, even as her eyes drooped. This time just lines, random shapes, maybe just for fun. When she finally fell asleep, Mason stood up, walked over to the front door and stared at it for a long while. Then he took the black marker from the kitchen drawer, the one Leah had used to label her books, and uncapped it. Slowly, deliberately, he bent down and wrote her name on the white wood, just above the baseboard, where it would be hard to erase but easy to see. He stepped back, read the name once, and exhaled. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't inked into his skin or carved in stone. But it was his way of declaring something real. And with that quiet act, with her name written on the door of their new temporary apartment, Mason whispered the word aloud for the first time in years, not like a question, not like a hope, but as something earned. Boom! At the Oceanside Civic Hall, the air felt heavier with meaning than ceremony. This wasn't just a formal gathering. It was a reckoning, a redemptive pause between what had been stolen and what might be restored. As the room hushed and the governor stepped onto the stage, all eyes turned to the small figure waiting by the steps. Leah, dressed in simple white, her hair pulled back with a navy blue ribbon that wasn't just a color choice. It was Mason's old navy ribbon, faded at the edges, tied carefully by Abby that morning. The crowd didn't know the full story. How the ribbon had once held together the pocket of a jacket Mason had worn into war zones. How it later held together a child's memory of the man who raised her. But Mason knew. As he watched from the second row, hand wrapped gently over Abby's, he felt a pressure rise in his chest, sharp and soft all at once. Abby's belly now curved with promise, a new life, but all his focus was on the girl, the walking toward the podium with a calm that outpaced her years. She didn't hesitate, not once, because she'd already done the hardest thing. She had remembered. The governor, to his credit, didn't try to own the moment. He didn't speak like a politician. His voice was low, a bit hoarse, as though even he knew words could only do so much. This medal, he said, holding the small, gold-plated emblem between his fingers, is usually awarded to those who serve in uniform. But today we give it to someone who served truth, at great personal cost. She saw what we didn't. She remembered what we forgot. The room erupted in applause, but Leah didn't flinch or smile. She only nodded once solemnly as the medal was draped over her neck. Her eyes scanned the room, not for approval, but for the one face that mattered. And when she found Mason, the shoulders hunched slightly, his expression trembling between pride and heartbreak, her lips finally curled into a small, knowing smile. She had walked into the fire for him, and now he was there, whole again because of her. Abby leaned into Mason and whispered, "That's your daughter." And Mason didn't speak, he just swallowed hard and nodded, because his throat had closed too tightly to allow anything else through. After the ceremony ended, the officials lingered, offering hands to shake and cameras to pose for. But Leah moved past them like they weren't there. She didn't want the spotlight, never had. She wanted her seat back. She wanted Mason. As she reached him, there was no fanfare, no announcement. She simply climbed into his lap like she'd done 100 times as a little girl when the nightmares had woken her. When her mother had died, when she didn't yet have words for grief but knew his arms were a place where breathing came easier. She didn't ask permission, and he didn't offer it. She just settled against his chest, arms looped loosely around his neck, head tucked beneath his chin. He wrapped himself around her in return, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel made of iron or stone or ash. He felt human. Her whisper came barely above silence. "Kept your promise." He tightened his grip around her, voice breaking with the weight of everything he'd held back. "No," he said, raw and clear. "You saved me first." There was more applause then, for the ceremony, the medal, the news cameras catching the moment, but neither of them moved. Abby stood beside them, one hand resting on her belly, the other gently touching the back of Mason's head. Her face was still, but her eyes shimmered. This family, fractured by falsehood, welded by love, had found its shape again, not through justice alone, but through tenderness. Mason didn't care what the papers would write or how the headlines would frame it. This wasn't a story about a Navy SEAL exonerated after a wrongful conviction. It wasn't even about the legal system failing and being redeemed. It was about a girl, a quiet girl who refused to forget, who noticed what others missed, who carried a broken piece of gold in her pocket like it was proof of something sacred. And it was. She had seen truth where trained men had looked away. She had held on to a love that even time couldn't erode. And now the world saw her too. She wasn't invisible anymore. Mason let out a long breath, one hand still cupped at the back of her head, the other resting over the medal that now lay between them. He had once faced gunfire, loss, betrayal, but nothing had undone him like the moment this small child wrapped herself around his broken pieces and never let go. The world might call it a miracle, he knew better. It was love. Stubborn, unspectacular, relentless love. The kind that lives in drawings and ribbons and whispered promises at visiting room glass. The kind that writes names on apartment doors and holds hands through 4 lines. The kind that takes a war-scarred man and teaches him how to be a father again, not with orders or tactics, but with trust, rebuilt inch by inch, silence by silence. This girl, this soft-spoken force of will, had saved a man the system tried to erase. And so, as the crowd clapped, the real healing unfolded not in the spotlight, but in that quiet embrace where a battle-worn man truly became a father again. And a girl once overlooked was finally seen by the whole world. What part of this story touched your heart the most? Share it with us in the comments. We love hearing your thoughts. Here at Your Channel Name, we create each story with care and purpose, thinking of people like you who carry so much life experience and emotion. If this video moved you, please consider subscribing. It's a simple click, but it helps us keep bringing you more stories that matter. And don't forget to explore our other videos. You might find a story that feels like it was made just for you. Thank you for being with us today. We're truly grateful for your presence.